In the year 985, Viking settlers, led by Eric the Red, made their way to the icy shores of Greenland. For over 400 years, these Norse settlers built a thriving community on an unforgiving land. But by the late 1400s, they were gone. What happened to the Vikings in Greenland? Where did they go? Today we're diving into one of history's great mysteries, the disappearance of the Greenland Vikings. Greenland's climate in the 10th and 11th centuries was much warmer than it is today. This period, known as the medieval warm period, allowed Viking farmers to grow crops and raise livestock on Greenland's grasslands. But around the 14th century, the climate began to change. A period known as the Little Ice Age set in, with temperatures dropping dramatically. The once green fields turned to ice, making farming nearly impossible. The Vikings relied heavily on their livestock, but as the climate worsened, their animals couldn't survive the cold, and the short growing seasons meant there wasn't enough food to go around. They were forced to rely more on hunting and fishing, but these new methods couldn't fully sustain their population. The harsh winters would have been devastating, slowly eroding the community's ability to thrive. Another critical factor was the isolation of Greenland from the rest of the Norse world. Initially, the Viking settlements in Greenland maintained strong trade ties with Europe, particularly with Norway and Iceland. They exported goods like walrus, ivory, sealskins, and even polar bears. But by the 14th century, these trade routes began to falter. One reason was the same climate change that made Greenland colder. The North Atlantic became more dangerous to navigate, with thicker ice and rougher seas. The once annual voyages from Europe grew less frequent, and eventually Greenland was cut off from vital supplies. Another piece of the puzzle involves the native Inuit people. The Thule culture, ancestors of today's Inuit, began moving into Greenland around the 12th century, just as the Norse were struggling with climate change and dwindling resources. The Thule were much better adapted to the harsh Arctic conditions. They had advanced hunting technologies, like kayaks and harpoons, and a deep understanding of how to live off the sea. While there is evidence that the Norse and Inuit traded and interacted peacefully at times, there may also have been conflict over resources. The Norse would have seen the Inuits' hunting grounds and advanced techniques, but instead of adapting, the Norse seemed to have stuck to their traditional ways. Some researchers believe that competition for resources might have led to violence, further weakening the Norse settlements. This brings us to another theory: cultural inflexibility. The Vikings in Greenland were, at their core, farmers and herders. They clung to these practices even when the environment no longer supported them. Rather than adopting the Inuits' survival techniques, such as using dog sleds or wearing fur clothing, they stuck to European customs, which were ill-suited for the harsh climate. In this way, their cultural identity may have worked against them. Adapting to the changing conditions would have meant abandoning some of the practices that defined them as Norse people. In the end, this refusal to change may have sealed their fate. Another factor that likely played a role in the downfall of the Greenland Vikings was the Black Death, which devastated Europe in the mid-14th century. While there's no direct evidence that the plague reached Greenland, it significantly impacted trade. Europe was in chaos, and trade with remote colonies like Greenland became less of a priority. With fewer ships making the dangerous journey to Greenland, the settlers there became increasingly isolated. This isolation made it difficult to acquire essential goods, like iron for tools, and the once thriving Norse society began to unravel. By the late 1400s, the Norse settlements in Greenland had disappeared. The last written records from the eastern settlement date to the early 15th century, with the church recording a wedding in 1408. After that, the records go silent. What happened to the last of the Vikings in Greenland? Did they starve, freeze, or were they killed in conflict? Some may have fled back to Iceland or Norway, but most archaeologists believe that they simply died out as their society slowly collapsed. By the time European explorers returned to Greenland centuries later, only the Inuit remained.